We begin in Ecuador, where it is the last day of campaigning for a referendum that could decide the future direction of the country. Groups in favor and against will have their closing rallies in the country's main cities ahead of the vote on Sunday. 40 organizations began their campaigns on January 3rd for a yes or a no vote. President Lenin Moreno called for the referendum on 7 questions, some of which will alter the constitution. More than 150 international observers from the OAS and UNASUR and other bodies are overseeing the vote. On Wednesday, the former president, Rafael Correa, who is campaigning against 3 of the 7 questions in the referendum, was trapped in a radio station after violence outside prevented him from leaving. Correa said the station was surrounded by supporters of President Lenin Moreno, some of them with firearms, who vandalized cars in his convoy. Correa wasn't hurt in the attack. Ecuador's vice president has condemned violence on all sides.
Any act of violence against a headquarters of a political party like Alianza País or against any person like the case of former President Rafael Correa will be rejected by all society who believes that democracy is built upon peace and dialogue.
Our correspondent Kristen Salas has more details.
Tomorrow, people with disabilities will vote as the National Electoral Council is set to assist them by bringing the voting sheets to their houses. Another important fact to keep in mind is that political and social organizations are closing their campaigns and can no longer conduct election propaganda. Closing campaign rallies are set to take place in the 3 main cities of the country, Quito, Guayaquil, and Cuenca. Former President Rafael Correa will hold his closing campaign rally in the province of Guayas, most probably in Guayaquil. Meanwhile, government representatives will close their campaign in Quito, the capital of the country. It's important to remember that Ecuador will vote on a referendum this Sunday to decide on 7 questions proposed by President Lenin Moreno. International observers are working today and tomorrow to prepare for the vote. The National Electoral Council gave the international observers a preliminary report that details how the electoral body prepared for the referendum and will train the delegates on the electoral process. Everyone is expecting the coming days to be calm, especially after the attack on Rafael Correa's caravan. We will keep you informed.
Thank you, Christian, for that report. The U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation is in Ecuador to assist with investigations into last Saturday's car bomb blast. They want to determine if the attack was in retaliation for a crackdown on criminal organizations linked to drug trafficking. The attacks happened in the northern cities of San Lorenzo and Eloy El Faro. No one was killed, but 14 police officers were injured in the explosion caused by the 50-meter blast, which damaged most of a police command center and neighboring homes. The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, says he is committed to reaching a final agreement with the opposition because only in peace can the country overcome its problems. Maduro was speaking after the Venezuelan government and opposition reached a pre-agreement at their talks in Santo Domingo.
There is a lot of expectation after more than 40 hours of talks. It was the 3rd day on the 5th round of talks between the Venezuelan government and the opposition after almost 2 years. They were decisive hours. After midday, the president of the Dominican Republic, Danilo Medina, broke the silence.
Today, we would like to announce that I have in my power the deed of the developments of these talks, which is signed by both parties and which I am a mediator. There is only one copy, because based on the principle that nothing is agreed unless everything is agreed, we cannot give more details about the developments.
Venezuela's government confirmed the signing of the pre-agreement. There are only a few details left that will be resolved in the next 72 hours.
The signing of this pre-agreement today is a ratification of the principle of sovereignty of Venezuela.
But the opposition denied it.
We must be very clear. There is no pre-agreement.
Right away, there was a commotion among the journalists.
What was signed then?
They didn't understand why President Danilo Medina's statement about a signed pre-agreement was being denied. This is how the talks ended. If they manage to agree on the last details, the next talks will be on Monday, February 5th. in the Dominican Republic's chancellery for the signing of a final agreement.
Chile has decided to withdraw its delegation from the talks between Venezuela's government and the opposition. Chilean government officials who were observing the talks in the Dominican Republic said that the parties have not reached a real and credible agreement and that the Chilean delegation will not take part in the next meetings. They say they will rejoin if both parties agree on presidential elections that are democratic. And the Venezuelan government has rejected the decision by the United Nations Secretary General to refer its border dispute with Guyana to the International Court of Justice. The Foreign Ministry in Caracas issued a communique in which it says it stands by the Geneva Accord of 1966, which set up the good offices process to resolve the dispute between the two countries over the Essequibo region. It says the Secretary General does not have the right to override that process, which Venezuela and Guyana have been following in good faith. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson arrives in Mexico today. This is part of a week-long trip which includes stops in Argentina, Colombia, Peru, and Jamaica. According to the State Department, the aim of the trip is to maintain pressure on Venezuela in a bid to press for economic reforms. His first stop in Mexico City comes at a time when relations are fragile. Mexico and the United States have been at odds over the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, President Donald Trump's protectionist trade policies, and the clampdown on immigration. 15 Mexican organizations have signed a document condemning the Secretary of State's visit, which the Mexican government says will deal with bilateral issues and the situation in Venezuela.
It is worrying because in what capacity and with what moral right do the Secretary of State of another country and our foreign minister decide to discuss the affairs of a third country? Bilateral matters are bilateral matters, and the same goes for multilateral issues. But it's not acceptable that the foreign minister begins to discuss the situation in Venezuela.
Our correspondent in Mexico City, Pablo Perez, has more.
So the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is starting a Latin American tour here in Mexico on Thursday, in a moment where USA-Mexico's relationships are at its lowest. President Trump's constant threats of ending NAFTA, pulling out of NAFTA, along with his racist comments about Mexican immigrants in the United States, and his threats of deporting thousands, hundreds of thousands of migrants back to Mexico, even if most of them come from Central America, have undermined the relationship between the two countries. It's noticeable that Mexican Chancellor Luis Videgaray has visited the United States over 33 times for 12 official visits to Mexico from the US government. And it's known that the deals, the renegotiation of the North America Free Trade Agreement are not going really well for Mexico. It seems that right now the strongest aid Mexico is getting comes from governors and politicians in the US that know that the North America Free Trade Agreement, ending the North America Free Trade Agreement, could be a problem for both countries and specifically for certain local economies. So we're going to see some negotiations, some says that they are going to try to ease the relationship between the two countries in this official visit that begins on Thursday.
We thank Pablo Perez for that report. Oil and gas company Royal Dutch Shell snapped up 9 out of 19 deep water oil blocks in the Gulf of Mexico in an auction by Mexico's oil giant Pemex on Wednesday. The auction, which is the most important since Mexico opened the energy sector to foreign investment in 2014, comes as President Enrique Peña Nieto tried to showcase economic renewal ahead of a presidential election in July. Mexican officials estimate the auction could bring in $93 billion in investments, but the move is seen as controversial, as Primex, once a proud symbol of Mexican nationalism, is slowly being sold off to foreign interests. Venezuela's foreign minister is beginning a trip to the Caribbean and Central America. Jorge Arreaza tweeted on instructions from President Maduro, "We are going to visit our sister countries to strengthen unity, solidarity, and sovereignty, which is an essential part of our destiny." Arreaza is expected to visit Cuba, Nicaragua, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency says it is not cutting off aid to hurricane-ravaged Puerto Rico. Backtracking from a statement made by one of its officials, on Monday, a FEMA official said food and water provisions would be shut off by Wednesday, prompting a public outcry. FEMA responded saying there's no decision to stop distribution of supplies. It says it has millions of liters of water and food to help the survivors of Hurricane Irma. FEMA has said since January 30th was actually the date to evaluate if Puerto Rico still needs aid. Hurricane Maria devastated the island 4 months ago, flattening thousands of homes and killing scores of people. Today, about more than 500,000 people are still without electricity. Crime has surged, and hundreds of thousands are struggling to get out of the country. And therapists in the Caribbean have met in Trinidad and Tobago to discuss the impacts of the 2017 hurricane season. Islands like Barbuda, Dominica, and Puerto Rico experienced severe devastation from Category 5 hurricanes. One psychologist explains that recovery is further impeded by a heightened sense of vulnerability and the loss of familiar faces due to death or migration.
Vulnerability, and when you're talking about an island nation where people don't have somewhere else to go unless they leave their country and home completely, there's a sense of helplessness and being trapped, and that militates against people being able to recover. It wears down your sense of resilience, because everywhere you look, when you're in a small territory, everywhere has been affected. So you can't say there's this place I can go to or there's this spot that's okay. It's across the board.
We take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting on. Welcome back. 5 of Costa Rica's presidential candidates shared their vision for the country in a debate ahead of Sunday's general election. Fabricio Alvarado of the Evangelical National Restoration Party continues to lead in the polls, appealing to voters with conservative and homophobic views, pushing back on an Inter-American Court of Human Rights' recent decision to legalize same-sex marriage, taxes, infrastructure, public transportation, and the role of the private sector in infrastructure projects were some of the topics touched upon in the debate. Amnesty International says the Peruvian government has not adequately justified the pardon given to the former president, Alberto Fujimori. The human rights organization presented its complaint to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, saying it is concerned about the particular events that led the government of Pedro Pablo Kaczynski to pardon Fujimori. This comes 2 days after the ISHR reviews the case in which Fujimori was sentenced to 25 years in jail. In Paraguay, the government is considering releasing political prisoners detained following the parliamentary coup in 2012. 11 farmers and 6 policemen died in a land conflict known as the Curugate Massacre. The conflict led to the removal of President Fernando Lugo. More details in this report.
After multiple unsuccessful complaints to the public ministry and the judicial system, Representative Rocio Casco is pushing for amnesty for campesinos convicted of a massacre during a violent eviction from public lands in 2012.
These institutions are placing facts from an invalid process before the people. During the Curuguati case, only one side of the event was ever investigated. We have reason to believe that evidence was concealed.
On June 15, 2012, 300 policemen violently evicted 30 campesinos from their lands. On that day, 11 campesinos and 6 officers lost their lives. The campesino deaths were never investigated.
If the sentence is overturned, the prisoners will be freed immediately. They might even get the chance to sue the state for the hardships they were put through. It's obvious that this investigation came with a ready-made political sentence.
5 years later, and after a sentence with no evidence, victims' families continue to demand justice outside the judicial court. They say they will continue to mobilize until the government listens to them.
We are still waiting for justice to be served. Next week, we will hold another week-long vigil outside the courthouse. We will bring more people to demand justice.
5 years ago, the Marina Quay settlement was occupied by campesinos. They were attacked by police when they resisted eviction. The farmers say the land was stolen from them and given to a new owner. Today, campesinos occupy the land and are rebuilding the community.
Severe flooding in southern Bolivia has affected at least 120,000 people. Dozens of homes collapsed after heavy rains pelted the city of Yacuba, which sits by the border with Argentina. Residents were forced to wade waist-high floodwaters to save their animals and belongings. The local civil defense says at least 40 families are now homeless. They are seeking rebuilding assistance from the government. Human rights organizations in Guatemala say that about 6,000 children and adolescents were the victims of sexual violence in 2017. A report carried out by the National Institute of Forensic Sciences estimated that sexual crimes have incurred in higher pregnancy rates of girls between 10 and 17 years. The Attorney General urged the government to take legal actions to condemn and investigate sexual violence in order to protect children's rights. Mexico City's Central Market is getting a facelift. To mark 35 years of business, the Central de Abasto will have its exterior walls repainted with 32 murals. The murals will be designed by both Mexican and international artists. Known as the city's breadbasket, Central de Abasto sells about 30 tons of produce and merchandise daily. More than 2,000 businesses sell everything from flip-flops to food. And we'll take one last short break. Join us after this look at what our multimedia team is reporting. Welcome back. The FBI and the White House have clashed publicly over a Republican intelligence memo alleging anti-Trump bias within the Justice Department. The FBI chief says he has grave concerns about the accuracy of the memo and has asked to halt its publication. The memo is believed to accuse the FBI of abusing its surveillance powers to target the Trump campaign. This furthers the rift between the White House and the agency that is currently investigating ties between the Trump campaign and Russia. In South Africa, in an emergency move, Cape Town authorities have limited the municipal water supply to 50 litres per person per day. The city is bracing for the day when it fully runs out of water. Cape Town has been scrambling to avoid a day zero scenario when taps are expected to run dry and its 4 million people would be left without water. City officials have announced that a day zero situation could most likely happen on the 12th of April. Over the past 3 years, the city has been facing its worst drought in a century. Changing climate and rapidly growing populations have made the matters worse.
So far, we've been saying to people, make sure you've got an emergency store of drinking water at home. Have at least 10 litres of bottled drinking water per person in your household. And start talking to your neighbours who's got alternative sources of water.
The Court of Arbitration for Sports has overturned a doping ban on 28 Russian athletes just a week prior to the Winter Olympics set to take place in South Korea. The court says there wasn't enough evidence to prove the sportsmen broke the anti-doping rules at the 2014 Olympics in Sochi. However, the International Olympics Committee says the group could only participate with their permission. Former head of Russia's anti-doping laboratory confessed provided banned steroids to athletes and swapped tainted samples for clean urine in Sochi on orders from the country's state sports officials. And Mexico said goodbye and good luck to its Winter Olympics team on Wednesday. In a ceremony in Mexico City, the delegation of 4 received the Mexican flag from the Olympic Sports Committee. They will be competing in freestyle, alpine, and cross-country skiing in Pyeongchang, South Korea. The games kick off on February 9th. Mexico is hoping the Olympiads will bring back a rare medal and help popularize winter sports in the South Latin American country. And now let's have a look at some other stories making headlines around the world.
Polish lawmakers have approved a bill that would jail people who suggest Poland was complicit in the Holocaust. The law bans any Holocaust accusations against Poles as well as descriptions of Nazi death camps as Polish. The legislation is being criticized by the US, Israel and the European Union.
But we all have to face the facts. All those countries who were under Nazi occupation during the Second World War had many, many heroes who resisted and who fought against that occupation. But sadly, in all those countries, there were always people that could be found to collaborate with the Nazi occupiers to implement their horrendous agenda.
A suicide bombing attack on a camp for displaced people in northeastern Nigeria has killed at least 6 people, including the 2 female bombers. 39 people were also injured. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, but Nigeria's emergency management agency suspects Boko Haram to be responsible. 11 people have been killed in a fire in the city of Sapporo in northern Japan that mainly housed elderly people on welfare. 5 other people were rescued. The cause of the fire is still being investigated and victims are still being identified. Hong Kong police have disarmed another 450 kg wartime bomb in an operation that lasted for 24 hours. The police evacuated close to 5,000 people before starting the operation. This is the second time within a week that an American bomb dropped during World War II had been discovered at a harbour front construction site in Wan Chai.
Because of the rain yesterday, the working conditions were not good. Because of the location, it was extremely difficult to be able to access it. And because of the nature of the firing mechanisms, the fuses, one of which we couldn't even see, it was extremely dangerous for the officers who were engaged in the disposal operation.
French President Emmanuel Macron has pledged support for Tunisia during the first visit to the country. He said that France would provide Tunisia with more than $338 million in new financing as it seeks to bolster the North African nation's democratic transition.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on the Tell Us Your website, tellusyotv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sweeney Gray. Thank you so much for watching.